I'm Jose Alvarez, the Faculty Director of the U.S. Asia Law Institute. Welcome to this program today, which is entitled China and the Future of the High Seas, Searching for Sustainability. Before we go to today's program, I just want to announce that this is actually a two-part series on China and the law of the sea. So next Tuesday, April 4th from 1:15 to 2:15, both live here at the law school and on Zoom. Be sure to register if you're doing either. We will have a program on the issues surrounding East and South China Seas, the strategic waters associated with those islands, that some people are starting to call the enforcement of China's law of the sea, and the regional challengers to that, as well as the costs imposed on naval powers around the globe. And the guest is going to be Dr. Isaac Gardon, a PhD and senior fellow for China Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and formerly an associate professor at the U.S. Naval War College, who has a new book called China's Law of the Sea, The New Rules of Maritime Order, coming out from Yale University Press. He'll be hosted by Peter Dutton, a professor of international law at the Stockholm Center at the U.S. Naval War College. For today's program, we're very privileged to have Professor Nengye from the Yung Hao School of Law at Singapore Management University, who is just arrived there in Singapore, I believe. Prior to that, he taught at 3 Australian universities, most recently as associate professor and director of the Center for Environmental Law in Sydney. He's an international recognized authority in the fields of law of the sea and international environmental law, having edited 2 books, The European Union and the Arctic, from 2017, and Governing Marine Living Resources in the Polar Regions from Edgar at 2019, has had presentations around the world across 5 continents, and we're very privileged to have him. And basically the topic, the China and future of the high seas, searching for sustainability. You will see some slides of his showing the great significance in terms of China's impact on distant water fishing. It is the 3rd largest commercial shipping fleet in the world. Advanced technology for exploring the deep sea is one of the things that characterizes China, and it has its own global satellite system. With that, I turn it over to a professor who's going to tell us a bit more about especially fishing and China.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Jose and Catherine, for hosting my talk here today. And last year, I had this great opportunity to come to New York and follow the negotiations on the BBNJ agreement, or so-called High Sea Treaty at the UN headquarters. So that was the first time I came to New York and NYU, and then and that treaty was just adopted actually early this month. So this gives me a great opportunity to talk about China and the future of the high seas today. And a bit of usual disclaimer. So my talk here today is totally personal. It doesn't represent any country or any organization or institution or funder. It is very much my personal observation, because when I was participating in the BBNJ negotiation, I was representing International Law Association. So I was only one there. So anyway, so to start with, we are now living in a troubled world, very troubled world. The Arctic ice is melting very fast. Climate change is getting worse, and we may lose 1 million species, according to a UN report published in 2019, if we keep business as usual over the next decade. And more so, we are gradually also living in a very dangerous world. The Ukraine war, which is still going on after a year, and there is no sign to end. And also, there is no sign that the US-China relations is getting any better in the near future. So in this troubled and dangerous world, as a little academic, my big question, or my my big hope at the moment of my research is how can we, even though we know that it's troubled, it's dangerous, but how can we still, we as a whole international community, especially countries, major powers like US and China, how can we move forward environmental cooperation? Because we do, in order to save the planet, we do have to cooperate, and it's in a very tense geopolitical setting. So this is a big question, and I think the adoption of the BBNJ agreement, which covers 60% of the world's ocean, gives me a great opportunity to have a case study on addressing this question, with focus on China's role and its future, and its future kind of potential place in the high seas. So just a little bit of a law of the sea background information that, we do have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was adopted in 1982 after 9 years lengthy negotiation. And it's a great achievement because it is the first time in the history that countries, they sit down peacefully and pretty much agreed upon a deal that to a large extent redistributed countries' jurisdiction at sea. So they set up a zonal approach with territorial sea, 200 nautical miles, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf. Somehow, the rest of the ocean is still kind of not completely left out, but it's pretty much like treated as high seas, which means the freedom of the country, the freedom of the seas are enshrined there. Time has changed. I mean, as time goes by, countries now have increased growing hunger for resources, be it fisheries and living resources, or minerals for our digitalization of life, like on the deep sea bed. So it can no longer be that the high seas can just be left behind or left out of any governance, because if we do so, then we will surely be doomed with the resources quickly depleted. So that's why the BBNJ agreement was negotiated. Its official negotiation started from 2018. It took 6 sessions to get there under the amazing leadership of the Singapore ambassador, Rina Lee. And finally, the agreement, a legally binding agreement text is there early this month. But I must also point out that the BBNJ agreement, which is called High Seas Treaty, doesn't cover everything about the high seas. The negotiation consists of 4 key thematic areas. So the first one is about marine genetic resources, how to collect, access, and share the benefit of the marine genetic resources. The second one is area-based management tools, that is largely about marine protected areas, how to establish marine protected areas. And then the third one is about capacity building and transfer technology. And finally, it's about environmental impact assessment, like how to conduct environmental impact assessment before conducting any commercial activity at sea. So I think my observation of the whole negotiation, and especially China's participation in this negotiation, offers me some great kind of ideas about what kind of role China could play in the future of the high sea governance, because this is reflected in their participation in this negotiation. The first kind of observation that I have is, I still remember that will be in my mind for my life, I think. So there was this one afternoon time, like the weather was like this, a bit gloomy, and then I was sitting in the conference room of the UN headquarters, and then the Bangladeshi diplomat, I think head of delegation, was almost in tears because he was trying to fight for the principle of the common heritage of mankind to be included into the new high seas treaty, because pretty much most developed countries rejected that, including Russia. So Russia was very kind of isolated in the negotiation, but very rare occasion that when it comes to whether the common heritage of mankind should be included, the Russian delegation was with Americans and also the Europeans. And it was China that jumped into the discussions, and then the Chinese delegate was there to back second Bangladeshi position on the common heritage of mankind. So it was that at that moment I was like, this is a deja vu, because I did read through the digitalized archive of the negotiation records of the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, between 1973 and 1982. And there, China was one of the wholeheartedly supporter of the principle of the common heritage of mankind. So what is this? Basically, it was kind of initiated by this amazing Maltese ambassador to the UN, David Pardo, in his speech at 1967 UN General Assembly. Basically, he proposed that for the seabed and its resources beyond 20 miles, it should be treated as a common heritage of mankind, meaning that a special agency should be established to administer the resources development in that area, and then for the benefits should be equally shared among developing and developed countries. So this principle has been considerably co-opted, unfortunately, in the final stage of the UNCLOS history. So what I mean is this principle was included in the UNCLOS text, but the most developed countries rejected to ratify UNCLOS if this principle is going to be implemented. So then, as a kind of a compromise, so a new Annex 14 was adopted in 1994. So there is still an international seabed authority established, but the common heritage of mankind principle was not really kind of seriously implemented. But anyway, so this was the history, but this history repeated in the high seas negotiation. And to my surprise, surely to my surprise, that China was still one of the kind of wholeheartedly great supporter of this principle, standing very firmly with developing countries. And the things have changed. And if you see that the deep seabed mining regime, which is a separate regime, but it's very much connected with the high seas regime in the law of the sea, China these days is one of the largest sponsor of exploration contracts in deep seabed. So they do have an interest. While in the 1970s, they had no real interest in the deep seabed. But China was still very much firmly supportive of the developing countries' position to include common heritage of mankind in this BBNJ agreement. And as you can see in the final text, Article 5, the principle of the common heritage of mankind was indeed listed as a general principle and approach of this high sea treaty. So this is very interesting. And of course, I mean, this is very interesting. This is very much a yesterday once more feeling for me. And but of course, I should also say that when it comes to implementation, like, I mean, the money sharing, the benefit sharing, we shall see, because this is not for the BBNJ, for the high seas, it is about development about the marine genetic resources. But I think the more serious part is coming very soon on the deep seabed mining, because the commercial deep seabed mining is very soon, and the International Seabed Authority now is drafting the mining code. So how exactly is the benefit going to be shared? I think that will be the test for this support of the common heritage of mankind principle. The second observation of my experience at BBNJ about China's role is like, I see that China now actually, even though the US-China tension is not going away, it's getting worse, they're having all these kind of dramas for all these years, but to some extent, I think they learn from each other, especially China these days, they behave sometimes like the United States. If you read the archives of the UNCLOS negotiation in the 1970s, oh my God, especially because it started from 1973. So that's when the Cultural Revolution was still going on. Oh my God, if you read those texts, it's like a very revolutionary, you know, the Chinese delegation would openly call, but by then, they were very much after the Soviets. So they were in a very bad kind of bilateral relations with the Soviets. So they openly called in the official negotiation record, you saw that they called Soviet Union the hegemony under socialist banner. So this kind of a very ideological language, you never see that anymore. You never see that in the High Seas Treaty. Rather now, China's participation is less ideological, more technical, and very much focusing on national interest. So it's very much a kind of a defensive approach on many occasions when on different kind of topics. And that is actually not different from the United States, because the United States has never ratified the UNCLOS, but the United States has always been there in the UNCLOS negotiation and also in the BBNJ negotiation. But why is the US delegation active in the BBNJ negotiation with the idea in mind that they would never ratify the BBNJ? It's defensive to make sure this won't affect my interest. So that's exactly the same what China has been doing in the BBNJ sometimes. A typical example is a dispute settlement. I think South China Sea arbitral award is the past, but I think the Chinese delegation definitely learned a lesson that to make sure that the dispute settlement the dispute settlement of the BBNJ agreement won't be set up to have any opportunity to be used against them. So they were really questioning whether the UNCLOS dispute settlement mechanism should just be applied to the disputes that arise in the high seas. They didn't achieve that, but somehow I think they certainly achieved to a certain extent that in the end, if you read the final text when it comes to dispute settlement, Article 55, paragraph 8, it does now give kind of a guarantee that nothing in this BBNJ high seas agreement shall be, and it's kind of in legally binding kind of a term, shall be interpreted as conferring jurisdiction upon a court of tribunal over any dispute that concerns or necessarily involves the concurrent consideration of the legal status of an area within that jurisdiction. So this gives a kind of a guarantee for kind of make sure that the BBNJ, the high seas dispute settlement mechanisms, even though it will largely rely on the existing UNCLOS dispute settlement mechanism, won't affect the disputed waters. And also, more interestingly, that's also exactly when China and the US are actually on the same line. They both were pro when it comes to the negotiation on the environmental impact assessment of all those. I'm talking about large-scale industrialized industrial activities at sea, such as this kind of a mega aquaculture farms in the high seas, this type of kind of activities. The US and China were actually on the same line. They both prefer to have a state-led approach for environmental impact assessment, meaning that now I have the capacity to conduct all those activities at sea. I will do the environmental impact assessment before I do so, but nobody can stop me. I will just do it. I will follow the rules. I will conduct the EIA, and then the next step is certain activities. The US delegation has very much similar view with Chinese delegation, even though they were in competition or so-called geopolitical tension. So as you can see, when it comes to these nuanced, detailed negotiations, the picture is actually quite different. So apart from those kind of media narratives. So anyway, the final observation that I had for this BBNJ negotiation and China's role is like, when it comes to the negotiation on the area-based management tools, that is the marine protected areas, I was just smiling for that whole session. I mean, because China and the US and the European Union have already had over a decade debates, quarrels, tense kind of a clash with each other in an organization that covers the Antarctic waters called the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. So the US US and New Zealand proposed to establish a MPA, marine protected areas in the Ross Sea of the Southern Ocean. That is the waters near Antarctica, which is beyond any country's jurisdiction. So China did support these MPAs, but China and Russia they were very much opposed to any other high seas MPAs proposals, which were proposed by Australia, European Union, Germany, Chile, and Argentina in different parts of the Southern Ocean for almost a decade now. So they had I think the atmosphere was far more tense in Kamala comparing to BBNJ. I think in the UN, that is a very special place. People are polite. I mean, they are negotiating, they have some different views, but they are polite. Oh my God, I was in Kamala in 2019 and 2021. They were really literally fighting for every comma of the annual report of Kamala. So, and they wouldn't agree on this. So this kind of course, it's more applied in BBNJ, but the key issue there is actually about sustainability. Because what is MPA? MPA is about balance between conservation and sustainable use of marine resources, but how to do so. So in the Kamala, China believes that those MPAs shouldn't be just be no-take, because Kamala does allow rational use. So this, and also in Kamala, the decision-making is consensus-based, which means one country's position can stop the whole kind of progress. So this was very much was everybody, I think countries learned their lessons from Kamala, and when they came to the BBNJ, so the US delegation proposed that we must go for qualified majority voting, because if we go for consensus, we will never establish any MPAs in the high seas. And China was very much against that. So, but it's about decision-making process, how to establish MPAs. But I think the key issue is come to the end is actually what are countries' will about sustainability in the high seas. So in the end, it's also quite interesting. And I think this BBNJ agreement is amazing, because in the end, what they did to reach the compromise is, okay, they say to establish the BBNJ COP will have the competence to establish MPAs. But the decision-making will be based on consensus. But then if no consensus is reached, then 3/4 majority voting will be used. But before they can use the 3/4 majority voting, a 2/3 majority voting will be needed by the COP to decide they can go for 3/4 majority voting. So so it's pretty much like, okay, everyone gets something, but kind of a compromise in the end. So I think this is a very interesting kind of compromise in the end about the establishment of MPAs in the high seas. So now let me conclude my talk today to share with you some of my views about China and the future of the law of the sea, and also what else we can do. I think there will be ultimately 3 dimensions when we talk about China and its role in the future of the high seas. The first dimension that we should never forget is decolonization. So decolonization, especially when it comes to the deep sea bed and high seas resources, the common heritage mankind principle, this is part of the decolonization process. So and in the law of the sea negotiations, UNCLOS and BBNJ, we do have this large developing country group called Group of 77. They don't stand together all the time, but when it comes to common heritage of mankind, they stand together. So this is still an ongoing process, because it has never been fulfilled that the developed countries, when they are going to start developing the resources in the high seas, they will share the benefit. So this is going to happen, but it's still not happened yet. So, and China is part of this, and it will be very difficult for China to give up this position openly, because this has been one of their key positions in the UNCLOS negotiation. So they need to be seen as consistent. So that's what they did in the BBNJ, in the high seas negotiation as well. So common heritage of mankind, whatever you do it in practice, but when it comes to the negotiations, you just can't keep it up. So this is the decolonization part. In the BBNJ negotiation, I don't see a sign, like a kind of a strong signal that China is trying to achieve the power shift. Because in the current system of international law, I think it's fair to say that it is very much a Western-dominated system with third world approach, or whatever you call it. But I think this could be where the tension is in some other fields, that there might be an attempt, or occasionally the ambition come from China to really try to achieve a power shift. So, and this power shift can also be mixed with the decolonization, because you can use decolonization as a tool to actually achieve a power shift. But the power shift, but so far, to be fair, I think so far in the high seas negotiation, and also in the foreseeable future, I don't see there is a significant signal about power shift in this space. So ultimately, the most important dimension, and also for those who are watching my talk today in China, this is my particular opportunity to call that if you really want to push for a narrative, kind of a very convincing narrative in the future of the planet and also the high seas, the best way to do so is to really try to think carefully and develop a proposal about how can we exactly achieve sustainability, because this is also for everybody's survival and future. It doesn't really matter you are China, you are US, you are other countries. We do need to be very careful with sustainable use of the resources in the high seas, minerals and fisheries, because if they are gone, and then we will be in big trouble. And for example, deep seabed mining, the minerals, there are only 2 parts of the planet that we can still conduct minings for those minerals for chips, for our, not French fries, for our smartphones and for our laptops. One is Antarctica, but it's banned. There is a Madrid Protocol, which has already banned commercial mining for 50 years. And then there is a review, but the review doesn't mean that it will expire. And then it's a deep seabed. So, you know, this kind of a high stake that you do need to think very carefully what kind of regime, apart from your national interest. And also, I would say sustainability should also be part of a country's national interest, especially for big powers like the US and China. That should be part of it, because if you don't do it, and if you don't do it carefully, that will come back to you sooner or later at some point. So that is something that I would say these 3 dimensions. And so finally, what can be done? And is there, to come back to my big question, is there a possibility to search for sustainability? I do have kind of a cautious optimism, because I have seen it in my eyes when countries, when they were all together negotiating the BBNJ treaty. And one particular forum, that is the United Nations, is indeed a very special place, because that's where multilateralism can help. In that space, it's like a bubble, I feel like. It's not like my daily life in Australia. It's really like a bubble, you know. You have an African group, you have small islands groups, you have Caribbeans, you have Latin Americans. So it's not, the world is not just about China and the US. There are so many different groups and countries. And then also, that actually also helps to ease the tension naturally, because you can really just join the group. For example, China, on many occasions, they are part of the Group of 77 negotiation team. So, you know, you have friends. So when you have friends, you don't feel lonely, you don't feel being singled out, and you know, so that's kind of like a person. So they do have this comfort in a very multilateral space. So I think that really helps. And multilateralism really can help to ease the tension between big powers and then try to achieve sustainability. And second thing that I think what should be done is fisheries. Because we have this biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction agreement without talking about fisheries. So they decided not to do so. It's kind of a silent means to all the countries, because fisheries are the real interest. When it comes to fish, nobody will give up an inch. So it's really a real interest. So when they started discussing the mandate of negotiation, all these countries decided, okay, let's just leave fisheries quietly kind of out of the negotiation. One reason, of course, is that there is a fish stocks agreement, 1995 fish stocks agreement of the UNCLOS. But you can't just leave fisheries alone or behind. So one concrete step that can be done in the near future is China now is considering to ratify the 2016 Port State Measures Agreement to prevent IUU fishing. I think they are now at that point. The US has done so already. The US has done so already. The US has expertise, has experience. So, you know, these are some kind of, I think, the technical step or possibilities that really the US can work with China, because this is about IUU fishing. I mean, if you help China to reduce IUU fishing, it helps the world. So, you know, so this kind of equal cooperation possibilities. And finally, we should also look into the sustainability of the high seas or the world oceans in a holistic approach, rather than now we have the high sea treaty, everything will be fine, because we will. So, for example, in June, the mining code, the deep seabed mining code is coming, or is supposed to come by the International Seabed Authority. The Convention on Biological Diversity just agreed upon a Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework for the next 10 years. It's non-binding, but it's also has a very high political stake. And also the UNEP is now negotiating a plastics treaty. So, you know, all these treaties, codes, they matter. They matter for our search for sustainability in the world's ocean, and especially in the high seas, because high seas is supposed to be commons for everybody. So the regime interaction should keep being played rather than just being separated or isolated, because then that won't help anyone. So I think I will just stop here. And thank you very much. I will just leave the time for our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was quite wide-ranging and quite rapid pace through the history of all of this. I'm reminded of an Indian expression, that's the country of India, when two elephants dance, beware for everybody else. And so here you tell a happy story of the US and China surprisingly being cooperative on certain issues. But along the way, you show us that because those two countries agree, it may be to the detriment of the rest of the planet, especially if they don't address the dwindling fish stocks and they leave it, the maritime protection areas are left to this complicated COP to reach consensus, and then 2/3 and 3/4. All of that is very nice for those countries. But if you really are sympathetic to the fact that climate change is affecting dwindling fish stocks and we're rushing to overfish, then there is a problem here, right? So I guess I want to push you on what to do when the two elephants dance. That is, what does the rest of the countries, including the global south, but the countries in between that could claim state status? I'm curious the position of Brazil in all of this, India itself. So do you have something more to say about when those two countries join up, does it help or hurt sustainability?
Yes, thank you, Jose. I think that's a fascinating question for me to think further. You know, when the US, China, when they did or does join up, so far I don't see any. I think let me give you one example. I think I didn't mention that much in details, but in Antarctica, in the Kamala waters, Southern Ocean, so there has been a push, which is actually ahead of BNJ, to establish a network of marine protected areas, which because the Southern Ocean is supposed to be the last frontier of the untouched water in the planet. So the NGOs, the environmental groups, they are trying to push the Kamala to establish marine protected areas to make sure that this untouched biomass, like krill species, won't be damaged by increased human activities such as fisheries. So the US was one of the US together with New Zealand proposed one of the MPAs in the Ross Sea. It's a huge area. Originally it's about 2 million square kilometers, and China was very vocally against this proposal for about. Starting from, I think the proposal was put on the table, officially on the table in 2012, and then China was very much against it until 2015, and then suddenly they decided to support this idea. Why? It's because Obama went to Hangzhou G20. That's a long time ago. G20, and he had a meeting with President Xi, and then they one of the, I think the MPA was one of the was part of the basket. Agreed between the two leaders. I think it's actually a positive example. So when they really agreed upon something, they really can. And then when China gave up its opposition, Russian delegation followed. So then the Ross Sea MPA was established in Antarctica. But things just stopped there. Then they started quarreling about more technical issues about Ross Sea MPA. So no new was established. So I think this is a case of a positive example about when they really join together, they can do something good for the planet. But what if they really join together to decide something and then what about others? I think that's a very legitimate question. And to be honest, I when I watch the negotiation, BBNJ negotiation, I didn't just watch Chinese delegation. I was in extensive conversation, especially with my developing global South colleagues, because they just more relaxed. Talk to me. So I had a conversation with Brazilian colleagues, with Indonesian colleagues, with some Pacific Islander countries. For them, for Global South, I think the best way, and it's very difficult, but the best way is to stick together. You need to stick together, because if you don't, you can't get through what you want. And for them, I think for one key issue for example, African group in the high seas negotiation is about common heritage of mankind. They want to share the benefit. They can't just let countries with advanced technology to conduct all those activities and take all the benefits. So they really want this to be done. And I think in the end they did achieve something because they really are unified on this position. All the developed countries more or less unified. But if you don't, like sometimes they don't know, and also it's a capacity issue. Like sometimes when I was talking to a Brazilian delegation, sometimes they just don't know. Like they don't really know what is their interest and what can be done. So they are a little bit kind of, also they are also a little bit kind of hesitant. Like what should be their interest? Should they allow a COP to have competence to establish marine protected areas in the high seas? Is that a good idea or is that a bad idea? So they are really not clear about this. So this comes to, once again, what especially countries like US and EU can do is capacity building, the transfer of technology, but more capacity building to develop, to increase the capacity of those global South countries so that they can go beyond, not just about sharing benefit, that's what they know, but also more technical kind of components of achieving high sea sustainability. And also the law enforcement, that's also at sea, that's also some kind of a problem.
So one of your articles deals with the changes in Chinese law relevant to deep seabed, not deep seabed, sorry, the fishing on the high seas. And you address the point that it wasn't too long ago, Argentina, for example, Ecuador had real problems with fishing fleets from China, basically fishing illegally in their economic zones, having to impose prison sentences for captains and crew, fines and everything else. And in our conversations, you suggested that thanks to Chinese law, these tensions have been lessened, taken care of. And one of the ways you suggested was actually technology, which is putting activation and identification systems onto the vessels so that if they actually cross over into an EEZ, someone in the Chinese government is alerted to this, and that seems to be highly effective. So when you say capacity building, is that what we're talking about? Because I think some people have, I want to know what technology should be shifted if we're talking about fishing. It sounds very basic, fishing, but I guess that's an example of technology.
Yeah, very good point. I guess it depends on who you are. It depends on which country. So there are two different types of countries when it comes to fishing. One is called distant water fishing countries. So you have China, you have Japan, you have South Korea, you have Spain. So they have large fishing fleets and they go outside their own waters to fish in the high seas. That's beyond national jurisdiction, pretty much.
And increasingly have to, because there's no fish around.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And also in other countries, so that's another type of country that is, they are the so-called the rich coastal states, for example, Argentina, Chile, and Indonesia, because they have large waters. And also, according to UNCLOS, it's kind of like a trade-off to establish the exclusive economic zone. So in the UNCLOS, there is negotiation, there is this trade-off. So because the exclusive economic zone, when the UNCLOS was negotiated, it's very much a new concept. It is a concept for those coastal states with rich fisheries resources to extend their jurisdiction to protect those fisheries resources. Like Chile is a typical example. They have such a long coastline and also rich fishing ground. So, but as a trade-off, it also allows other countries to have access to those fisheries resources if there is a surplus. So as a coastal state, you can enjoy sovereign rights over your fisheries in your exclusive economic zone, but you should also allow other countries to come in under legally agreed under legal agreement to access to those surplus. So I mean, it really depends on which countries are we talking about. I guess in this case, we are more like talking about those developing countries. They have rich resources like Ghana, Argentina, Chile, and they have large waters, but they don't have capacity or enough capacity to enforce their laws at sea, and especially when it comes to illegal, unregulated, and unreported IUU fishing conducted by those distant water fishing countries. So here, I think the technology comes such as the tracking, like tracking technology, satellite system, and also you need to have ships. I mean, the coast guards need to have good ships, better ships, so they can be they can catch those who illegally come into their AEZs. Because in some cases, the coastal states, they have very weak law enforcement power. So even if they could identify those IUU fishing boats, they cannot catch them because they just run back to the high seas. So I think, but also this is not necessarily just a developing country problem. Like in the 80s, for example, Canada had this issue with Spain. So what the Spanish fleet did was they just, because the fish, they don't recognize boundaries. And so this is even more serious. This is even more kind of tricky because the Spanish fleet, they just stop at the edge of the Canadian EEZ, the one the fish crossed. They catch it, so that really caused the problem. So also this is a serious problem, and also this is also the BBNJ, I think, indirectly is trying to address this to establish marine protected areas, because you cannot just protect your own exclusive economic zone, because fish, they don't recognize boundaries. So and also increasingly now these distant water fishing states, they have huge capacity to deplete almost all fish stocks on the planet. 70% of the world's fish stocks are now overexploited or seriously almost reached the limit of sustainably reproduce themselves. 70%. So that's why they're fighting in Antarctica, because that's the 30% left is untouched. So this is of course not just about coastal state. This is more like all countries, they need to really get together and then work together and to make sure we don't deplete everything.
So one of the issues that you raised is the silo effect of these various regimes. And we have biodiversity, we have the plastics treaty, we have now climate change negotiations, and they're all interrelated, because all of them will have effects on fish stocks, for instance. So, but that's endemic so far. International law tends to proceed this way through individual treaties. Is there something that ought to be done to break apart the silos? That is there something that the UN should do or some other body so that there is more of a relationship? Because it's shocking that the climate change negotiations don't mention the impact on fish, for instance. So what can you say about how we can think about breaking those?
Yes, I must say this is such a difficult thing to do when it comes to the development of international law to start with. Like even when they negotiate the BBNJ, oh my God, you will see this all the time, that the countries, it doesn't really matter, China or US or Japan or EU, they just keep mentioning, not undermining. So this is even a principle in negotiations, so not undermining other regimes. So it seems that, I don't know exactly why, but it seems that it's kind of like every time when countries are trying to negotiate something, they just really want to narrow it down to not kind of bring everything together. So countries become very nervous and sensitive. Like if you talk about climate change, you can only talk about climate change. If you are trying to bring something else on the table, then they will just start, pushing the way. So also that's why probably fisheries are not mentioned or not directly addressed in the BBNJ negotiation with regard to high seas. Well, I have really thought about this, how to break the barriers between all these kind of regimes. I think the most pragmatic way is probably just to strengthen the information sharing. I think that's what those organizations, international organizations, have been trying to do, and some are doing. Like, it doesn't really matter, you are International Seabed Authority, you are International Maritime Organization, you are FAO, Fisheries and Fish and Agriculture Organization, and now there is this new BBNJ. There will be a COP, Conference of Parties, being established. You just need to talk to each other, and probably to start to not just talk to each other informally. You do need to have kind of a coordination, kind of a mechanism to share the information between different kind of organizations, so that you don't overlap and you don't really step on each other's nose. I think that's the
well, I suppose some people would say that it's partly who you send on these delegations. If the delegation consists purely of fishing experts, they're not going to be comfortable talking about anything else. But you mentioned now information. And so I'm looking for insights as to what there could be relevant to this issue that would distinguish the US and China. And in your article, you mentioned one thing that strikes me as different is the level of transparency. So that with respect to fishing, you mentioned that there's deep suspicion about the Chinese statistics here that say we've only fished 1.3 million tons per year, when it's probably closer to 4.6 million tons. And so that's a pretty big difference, right?
Yes.
And I guess the other question that I have is the motivations of the underlying regime, the actors, the private actors, or in the case of China, perhaps more connected to the government, but I'm not sure. That is, I would think that it would be in this case more difficult to try to control the profit motive on the US side of things than on the other side. But can you take me into any real differences between the US and China that might be relevant to how this thing will work out?
Yes, I think it's quite interesting in this space, because this is not a fishing state to large extent. The US doesn't do that much fishing by herself. So the US is one of the largest importer of fish products in the world. So the US consume a lot of fish, but the US doesn't do fishing because fishing is a very it's a very tough business. I mean, you need to really have a lot of fishermen, stay in a small boat and in the middle of nowhere with no shower, very disgusting food, for like 2 months, 3 months, and then
we don't do disgusting.
Well, I mean, it's pretty much like, I think the issue here is the human cost is in the US is very high. So I mean, as a developed country, so it's not profitable to conduct this kind of business by hiring a large number of fishermen and just send them to. I mean, the Europeans did this in the 16th century, like until 19th century, right? They went around the globe to try to find fish and whales and sealing. They do this all the time, but then they stop because they become developed. They have the human cost is too high. So I think now in China's case, with a country with 1.4 billion people, I think it is still at a stage, even though the country also now is not least developing country per se, but the salary, I think the human cost is still relatively low comparing to those very developed countries like US and EU. So that's why there is still a kind of an incentive to try to build this fishing industry to really provide job opportunities for people, especially those low income kind of people from rural side to make a living. So I think this is a huge, this is the main difference between US and China in this space. So ideally, these two, one is a large importer of fish products, and one is the largest distant water fishing country in the world. I think when it comes to the, so I'll talk more about this, but even for this, I think these two, they can and they should work together. And also, there is one thing that you cannot lie, that the fish, because the fish will eventually land in a port. So when you import fish, and then all the fish will land in a port. Then the port authorities will have the sovereignty jurisdiction back what you have for those fishing companies and fishing boats, what you have done, how many fish you have caught, and there any problems, your logs. They can legitimately check all this information at the port. So I think there is a huge potential. That's why the US has quickly ratified the port state measures agreement to combat illegal fishing, while China hasn't. But they are thinking of doing this because they also want to be seen as a responsible, sustainable player in the fishing industry. And also they have to, because if you see this as a strategic industry to produce job opportunities, you also need to fish sustainably, because if you deplete all the fish resources, this whole industry will collapse. So that's why you see the Chinese Chinese fishing companies, they actually put the ban on seasonal fishing by themselves, voluntary fishing bans, because if you don't give fish time to reproduce themselves, you won't have fish anymore. So I think there is huge potential here for them to collaborate. So, but when it comes to the Chinese side, when it comes to fisheries, there are a few issues about those figures. So I don't deny any of them. Like I don't. So I think when it comes to official statistics, I was being asked about this question a number of times. I'm not trying to defend the Chinese authority, but what I can understand is like they only count the fishing vessels under Chinese flag. So there is a flag convenience issue in the shipping world, that you can easily just buy another country's flag. And then because that flag is cheap, meaning they don't charge you tax, they don't charge you, they just charge you $2,000 as an annual fee, and then you can use their flag, for example, like Liberian, Mongolia, and Mongolia has a huge maritime bureau just to give a flags. So but I think for the Chinese authority, they don't count those flag of convenience in their statistics, which may be actually still beneficially owned by a Chinese fishing company, but they don't. And also, I think it's legitimate for them not to do so, because it's not under their flag, which means it's not under their control, according to international law. So I think this is something that may partly contribute to that difference, like huge difference between in the official report it says it has only 1,000 vessels, and then I think people like Daniel Pauly and those marine scientists, they use Global Fishing Watch to track those vessels in the high seas and how they, but these days you can do so, and then you can track them and then count altogether. Oh my God, actually there are 2,600 vessels at the high seas. But the thing, these are maybe both correct, I would say. No, I don't think they are trying to hide anything, because they are, even if you are trying to hide something, you are already the largest fishing country in the world. So
somebody might know.
Yeah, everyone knows that. So that's kind of my explanation on this. Yeah.
So as an academic, I couldn't resist. In one of your pieces, you mentioned China's shifting role from norm antipreneur to entrepreneur. And I had never heard the phrase antipreneur, but as you describe it, is resisting the existing norms, and entrepreneur is to change what we have. And I think I gather from your piece that, at least with respect to this regime and fishing, China is not trying to change the rules. Neither is it being an anti-preneur. It's being a rule complier. Did I misunderstand something?
I think when it comes to BBNJ, the High Seas Treaty, you can see that they are both anti-preneur and entrepreneur. But even as an
so goes that reading.
Yes. But even entrepreneur, I think it's in a way it's different from. So China being a rule entrepreneur, I think it's different to a large extent as those we are familiar with, like the European Union. So the European Union, like what they are trying to do in all these negotiations, be it climate change, ICs or data protection, they are trying to push the standards, right? So they are trying to push the standards very high. Whether they can comply with that, that's a different question. But they certainly have this kind of I don't know. It almost sounds like it also sounds like a crusade that I just want to really push the standards very high. I think when it comes to China, it's not that type of entrepreneur. What they are trying to do is like, okay, if I think this is not of my interest, in the past they just say no, keep it away. No, I disagree. I don't respond. I think now I can see in the high seas, the negotiation, or like in Kamala, they are trying to put on the table their own proposal, but the proposal is once again is to defend their own interest. So I think that's the development. That's the development.
So, oh, by the way, I should remind folks on Zoom, as well as here in the audience, anytime you want to submit questions and raise your hands, please do so. This is not supposed to be just a little dialogue, although I'm enjoying this tremendously. And so another thing that you raise is reputation here. So one of your slides before you changed them indicated the GDP and how China has now out GDP'd the EU. And of course, that means that it's not credible to suggest that China is a developing country. And yet, from the days that you were describing of the negotiations for UNCLOS till today, it still purports to be a leader of the global South. And I always thought a little suspicious about that. But you're saying that because of their reputation as being a leader of the global South, they have to adhere to certain positions. So they're stuck on their own petard. They may not be a developing country, but they have to still act like one. Is that right?
I think that you surely capture the point, but let me just further elaborate this a little bit. So what I call China today, when it comes to these international negotiations, I would call China as a hybrid state. So what do I mean by hybrid state? So on the technological front, for example, the capacity to do fishing, shipping, deep sea mining. On the technological front, China is surely not a least developing country. China is not Palau or like Liberia, and they do have the capacity. But if you consider China as a whole, and yes, the Chinese GDP is, and I was astonished by this achievement last year, because they overtake the European Union as a whole for the first time in history. But the European Union consists of 27 countries. So it's not just Germany or France, it's the whole of European Union. And China now is the second largest economy truly in the world. But if you consider GDP per capita, if you consider the population in poverty, and if you consider the gap between the rich and poor and all these issues, I think there are certain aspects of the country that are still truly being a developing country. So they are like, it's kind of like they are in this transition, like not developed. Some aspects are developed, some aspects are developing. So they are hybrid. So yes, to some extent, it's kind of like being stuck. But also, it's not just a reputation, because when you are negotiating international treaties, I mean, in international law, one fundamental thing I would say is to be consistent as a government. So it's not just about, yes, it's about reputation, but it's also about state practice. They have to be consistent, because otherwise, if you are not consistent, then you don't have a firm standing when it comes to, I don't know, future negotiations, or like other ways to develop international law or implementation international law, and also to talk to other countries, like to collaborate with other countries. Like say, I'm trying to see how US and China can collaborate, but if there is no consistent position, then there is no ground to collaborate with each other, because nobody will trust you. So I think it's not just a reputation, it's actually a kind of real interest for any government out there to be consistent. Because if you're not, what comes around goes around comes around. But that's kind of why, especially when it comes to common heritage of mankind, this principle that even though now they have capacity to conduct deep space mining, they are not actually in the developing countries block, that they don't have capacity, so they have to ask for sharing from developed countries. But because they have been such a big promoter, a supporter of this principle in the 1970s and 80s, they have to be. Yeah, they have to be, because all these other 133 countries will come to you and say, please, you know.
So we have two questions. We'll start at the back and then work our way forward. Yes, please.
Hi, this is great. I'm Ira Bjorga. I would love to hear a bit more about UNCLOS. My impression, and maybe there's a point about consistency here too. My impression is that the Chinese position has changed a little bit. China became a state party around about 1996, I think.
Yes.
It seems to me that the South China Sea arbitration really scarred China as regards its relationship with UNCLOS.
Yes.
And in the UN context now, I understand that China is doing really what it can to remove references to us where it would previously have been perfectly fine with, documents that are, that come up every year or biennially, have references to UNCLOS. So I'm not necessarily homing in on inconsistency, but I'm interested to know a little bit more about your views as to China's developing approach, let's say, to UNCLOS.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's a fascinating question. And I think, I didn't have time to talk about this because I only have 15 minutes about my presentation, but I do prepare. I did prepare quite a few slides before about China's positions in the UNCLOS negotiation. So when they were involved in the UNCLOS negotiation, it was a very different time. So it was a time in the first phase, China still was in Mao's time. So it was very chaotic and ideological driven kind of negotiations. They were very much standing with all the developing countries, anti the superpowers, hegemony. So I think after that, even after that, after that period, when Mao passed away in 1976, and then Deng Xiaoping came into power, and then so the Chinese delegation, if you read all those digital archives, you will see that in the early 1980s, the delegation's tone became much more kind of technical, but it's been kind of like a little bit late, I would say. So even for the UNCLOS itself, I think occasionally the Chinese scholars and officials have never stopped doubting about some provisions. Like I was reading on my way to US, I was reading a book written by a Chinese diplomat. So he was the deputy head of delegation, but actually the acting head of delegation of Chinese delegation to UNCLOS in 1976. So in his book about his whole life as a career diplomat, he has one chapter sharing his thoughts about UNCLOS, and most of it was like actually he was a bit kind of not happy with the exclusive economic zone, for example. Yes, so even after the adoption of UNCLOS, they have never stopped doubting about this. Like because in those days it's very ideological driven. The exclusive economic zone was one of the conditions for China to establish diplomatic relations with Latin American countries, Chile, Argentina. So then, of course, these countries they benefit greatly. So then China put forward to support the establishment of EEZ as part of the anti-hegemony strategy. But actually, the two superpowers also benefit greatly from this exclusive economic zone because US has no neighboring countries that face together. So they face the US in a narrow way. So the US could extend 200 miles, and Japan, like for example, Japan's land territory is about 370,000 square kilometers. With the establishment of the EEZ regime, Japan's territory expanded to 4.4 million. That's a huge difference. So, I mean, when you are saying you are trying to support the EEZ as part of your strategy of anti-hegemony and developed countries, they actually also benefit from this. So, this was written by the Chinese diplomat in his autobiography. So, this kind of stuff never goes away, But it's a bit too late. I think, let's say, to be fair, overall, China is very supportive of the UNCLOS. You can see that what they did in the BBNJ, they really invested a lot of resources, and its delegation is one of the largest delegations in the negotiation. And also, I think they are happy. I think in the end they are generally happy with the BBNJ agreement. I was told, but without achieving some of the negotiation goals, but still, to a certain extent, they are happy with that. So I think overall, I think the relationship between China and LOC, in my view, and I agree with you, they are certainly scarred by the South China Sea arbitration, for sure. But in my view, it's overall supportive, but never stop doubting. That's kind of my observation.
You had a question.
Thank you. My name is Wilson, and I'm founding a company called Complexity, which uses systems thinking to solve big issues. And I use what's called STIPLs, which is geosocial, geotechnical, geoeconomic, environmental, geolegal, geopolitical, and geostrategic. That's a big thing from the OECD. When I was growing up in Africa, they used to say, when two elephants make love or they fight, that's found out from it's funny one. Or it used to be when America sneezes, the whole world gets pneumonia, and now it's both of them. We get COVID, I think. I think from my experience, you have to change the incentive structure and the issue of coordination in political economy, institutional economics. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm coming from that perspective. In terms of coordination, African countries will never coordinate with each other because of their own self-interest. And with China investing a lot of money on the Belt and Road and everything, their interest is with China right now. Even in the United States, when you look at social analysis, most people are concerned about carbon emissions, which is a big issue. We didn't know what he's talking about the fisheries. And the lobbyists, Washington DC, are promoting the fisheries and everything. So it's really hard to do that. Changing incentives, from what I've seen, is not only changing American law and a lobbying thing. Isaac was at Columbia a couple of weeks ago, and I listened to his lecture, and he said most of the law is in custom international law, and China can change the custom anytime they want, and that's what doing it. Because when you look at geopolitics right now, the geopolitical alignments, if you look at the Quad or the ICUs, I would say AUKUS, Japan and China, the new diplomatic thing, then when the Chinese side, the Chinese and the Pakistan, India getting involved, it's very complex. And they can change the law or the customary law whenever they want to, because they need the power. My question is a little bit different after saying that. And stay tuned for my company going live very soon, Complexity. The biggest concern I have is about the Arctic. That's a very, very tricky geopolitical issue. Number one is climate change, all that feedback loop and methane emissions and everything. But all these countries, Russia, China, the United States, are looking, because it gets the trading thing shorter for them. And no international law, I think, that deals specifically with that. I mean, there's some negotiation going on, I think, but not really effective. And even the Biden administration has its own within the Science and Technology Office to deal with the Arctic. But where do you see the prospect? Because I think that's going to be the next source of war. All of them need it because it's going to make transportation very cheap through the north side.
Yes, thank you for your question. I mean, Arctic is close to my heart because I have I've done my research on the Arctic for about a decade now, and including 5 years of my time traveling around in the Arctic when I was based in Germany and Scotland for my postdoc. So things are not that bad, to be honest. So there is always this kind of saying, oh yeah, Arctic is going to be the next South China Sea. But even if you look at South China Sea, yeah, there are some tensions. But I think when it comes to when it comes to Arctic, there are all these kind of you are right, because of human-induced climate change. Now humans, especially major powers, are looking into those opportunities caused by human-induced climate change, such as shorter shipping routes, especially along the Russian coastline, the Northeast Passage, or the Northern Sea Route, as the Russians call it.
And fishing as well.
And fisheries, yes. So, but the Arctic governance is so far, I think it's actually going on solid, I would say, because the Arctic governance is different from Antarctica. So the Arctic is called kind of like a multi-level governance regime. So the Arctic is the ocean, so the UNCLOS does apply there. So it's melting. So the ocean actually applies UNCLOS, and this is now more or less recognized by international community, because the 5 coastal states, US, Canada, Russia, Norway, and also Denmark through Greenland, this benefits them hugely. So in the Arctic, when you apply the UNCLOS, then you establish your own territorial sea and exclusive economic zone, and there is actually very minimum sovereignty dispute in the Arctic. So the foundation is very clear. So even China published its own Arctic policy in 2018. And in order to get in to Arctic affairs, China actually also guaranteed in its Arctic policy that they will respect existing international law that is applicable to the Arctic, which means the UNCLOS is applicable, BNJ is also applicable in the Arctic, and then there is no sovereign dispute there. So what are at stake? There are 2 things. One is shipping, so the shipping routes. So shipping routes, there are some long-lasting, actually, debates between US and European Union on the one side, and Canada and Russia on the other side, because the Canada and Russia said this Northeast Passage along Russian coastline and Northwest Passage along Canadian Arctic, they are pretty much internal waters. So because it's ice covered, it's a history, so it should be totally under their jurisdiction. And the US and the European Union said, no, come on, this is not. This is straight used for international navigation. So this has been lasting for 60 years, starting from 1965. So the only difference is there is a newcomer, China. China now is coming to the table. I have written quite a few pieces on this about, like my latest piece, if you are interested, just published by Leiden Journal of International Law last year. So I compared China's Arctic policy on the shipping route and the Russian legislation on the Arctic shipping route, and see what could be the future. And the reality is, Russia, because now the only commercially viable shipping route in the Arctic is actually the Northern Sea route along the Russian Arctic. And it is in practice under Russian jurisdiction. So the Russians actually treat that shipping route as part of their kind of internal waters. So, and China accepts that. So what they do is they apply for the approval, so they apply for the permit. So there is this Northern Sea administration by the Russian government. So not just China, but also all these other countries, Japan, South Korea, if they want to use the Arctic shipping route, they just submit their application to get a permit. Normally they get a permit, and then in the summertime, when the shipping route is open, then they just use it. So, I mean, do they openly agree that this is Russian internal waters? No, nobody does that. Nobody does that.
But getting the permit is pretty.
Yes, but in practice, they are cooperating, because what else can we do that? So when it comes to fisheries, in 2018, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement was adopted between the 5 Arctic states and then the 5 fishing states: China, Japan, South Korea, European Union, and Iceland. So that is something interesting to be watched, because what they say there is, so the agreement entered into force in 2020, but what they are going to do is there will be a ban on commercial fishing for 16 years. And in between these 16 years, all these 10 countries, they will set up a joint scientific and monitoring program to further explore and research on the fish stocks kind of a situations as to do the fish stock assessment and also to better understand the marine ecosystem in the Central Arctic Ocean. And then once the 16 years, and that's when I think we will see some future drama, because even now I can sense there are two groups of ideas. One group is like, we have banned the commercial fishing now. We should do it late. We should do it after 16 years for sure, because then we should really just establish a marine protected area and no fishing is allowed there, because it's Central Arctic Ocean, it's a very vulnerable marine ecosystem. And another group of countries like, now we wait because the ice is still melting. We don't know yet. So once we know what's going on, how the fish stocks assessment is done, we know what is there. Let's set up a regional fisheries management organization so we can allocate quota and conduct sustainable fishing. So that is something we will watch, and it will come. 16 years are actually very short, so yeah, it will actually come.
But my point is, 16 years, I know it's short, but I'm more of a international relations hawk, so we got to be prepared right now, because in 16 years, China is going to be the largest economy. The relationship with China and Russia is growing right now, and even Pakistan threatening India. And they can change the rule of the game whenever they want to. And there's nobody to enforce it. NATO is growing with, I think, Denmark and Sweden who just joined. So
Sweden and Finland.
Sweden and Finland. And I mean, the Quad might deter them from doing that maybe, but there's so many uncertainties that I think looking at it from that perspective and getting ready for it is a better way. I'm not being influenced by American propaganda, I understand that, but like,
yes, but I tell you something. You know, this is something people always are shocked when they heard about this. When it comes to Arctic, your favorite and my favorite topic. So, China became an observer of the Arctic Council. Arctic Council is the most important regional cooperation body in the Arctic. Only the 8 Arctic countries, US, so those countries you mentioned, US, Russia, Norway, Canada, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, they can decide who can be a admitted observer. Guess which country is the last one to say yes?
Russia.
Yes, it's Russia. You know why? Because it's Russia. Russia has the longest coastline in the Arctic. They have a huge interest. Of course, they need to find a new market. No, of course, Ukraine changed a little bit because they need to find a new market, oil and gas, but it's their Arctic. You know, so this is why when we look into this, so those big geopolitical tensions, I also like those things, and also, you know, sometimes make me feel like we are living in a very dangerous world. But you know, when I'm in the ground, when I'm on the ground, when I'm really watching the negotiations and what's going on, you see the different picture. You see the nuance. You see the real interest and how countries behave when it comes to their real interest. I mean, there were those days like 1970s and 60s in this very ideological period. The romantic revolutionary period. No, it's gone. Yeah.
So yes. I want to make sure, are there questions from the floor? So Catherine, please.
So Peter Dutton asking a question about the South China Sea, actually, but it has wider implication. So he's noting that China's claims in the South China Sea actually affect the size of the high seas there, because China is claiming as its own waters that others consider the high seas. So his question is two-part. Does China believe that its claims are exceptional? In other words, that China's attempt to take what others regard as the high seas and make them Chinese, that other countries wouldn't do a similar thing? Or does China believe that its claims in the South China Sea are normative and may be copied by others? And then the second part of the question is whether or not you would see a tension then between China's expansive claims to territory that remove large areas of high seas and make them Chinese territorial waters, a tension between that and its support for this concept of a common heritage of mankind.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Peter. I know that sooner or later there will be a question about South China Sea, and it's very predictable that Peter will ask this question.
Well, the good thing is, of course, we have another session on this, but you might as well deal with it now.
Yeah, and it's Peter who is asking this question. So thank you, Peter. So I must say, I'm not sure about this question, because South China big. South China Sea actually is not big. South China Sea is kind of like a semi-enclosed sea area. So I highly doubt, if I'm not mistaken, because I've seen those maps, even though I haven't really closely followed South China Sea for quite a while. Even if every country put their claims of 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea, is there any high sea left? I'm really not sure about that. So because I see
So
that.
if everybody followed the rules, there's not much to debate, you sort of person.
No, what I'm trying to say is, even if everybody applies the UNCLOS, there is no high sea there. So I mean, this question, this is my first kind of a reaction response to this. It's like if there is no high sea there, so I mean, China's practice in South China Sea is totally different from China's practice in the high seas, no doubt. Why? From what I can understand is because of their claim. It is exactly because of their claim that they do believe they have the territorial claim in South China Sea. Whether this is legal or illegal, South China Sea arbitration, that's someone will talk about it next week. But I think here we need to be very careful because the law of the sea is not just about South China Sea. So there are two things. I think there are two aspects to look at this question. If I can answer, is that first thing is when I look at China and the law of the sea, it's pretty much about the world's oceans. It's not just about South China Sea, because South China Sea, in a sense, China really has a very serious territorial claim. So the 9-line is a territorial claim. It's not a claim based on UNCLOS. It's much earlier, before the UNCLOS. So the legal status of claim, that's a different question. But my understanding is they do have a serious territorial claim in the whole part of South China Sea. So then this can, to some extent, be separate from China's broad position and practice and participation in the development of the law of the sea as a whole, like BNJ, because it's about high seas, it's about like deep seabed mining, which is coming, and also even general UNCLOS negotiation. I think that's one thing. But the second thing is another way around. Is indeed that's also kind of connected to what you just said, that my interest here is to what extent the regional approach can alter the general principles of law of the sea. But I'll give you one example. This week, it is actually going on in Fiji at the moment, that they are now hosting a big conference on the loss of state. So why? Is because the sea level rise, and then the island, those South Pacific islands might just be completely covered by the water. But the question is, one of the fundamental principles of the contemporary law of the sea is called land dominates the sea. So you have the land, you have territory, and then you start from there, you have a baseline, then you start claiming your jurisdiction, territorial sea, exclusive economic zone. So when you lose your land, can you still claim your maritime jurisdiction? So what the South Pacific countries are trying to push is a regional approach called South Pacific approach, that let's fix the baseline. I think that's legitimate because it's really existential for them, the climate change. So they want to, also this is good for the stability of the international relations, that even though you lose your land because of climate change, it's not their fault, to be honest. So they still will keep their fixed baselines and their maritime jurisdictions and everything, even if they eventually they lose their sovereignty over that island because of the climate change. So, but this is legitimate. This is acceptable. I'm supportive of this approach. But this approach is a very good example of the regional practice or regional approach to change one of the fundamental principles of the UNCLOS. So if this can happen in South Pacific, this could also happen in the Arctic, where they face the same issues, the sea level rise and ice melting. And what China is doing in the South China Sea is, of course, not this type of change, but it's like, for example, the negotiation of the code of conduct in the South China Sea. I think that's a very good example. I don't follow it so far, but they are definitely negotiating with ASEAN countries. There is this South China Sea arbitration award, but if they can get a code of conduct for ASEAN and China in the South China Sea. Could this be actually a way to alter the South China Sea arbitration award? Because it's a regional approach, because all countries agreed. ASEAN, 10 countries, and those coastal states in the South China Sea and China, they both agree. If they haven't done that yet, they agree a code of conduct. Can this regional approach alter the general international law? So I think that is a more valid question in the South China Sea. I don't know if I answered Peter's question, but that's kind of in my mind.
Are there other questions? Because we're running close.
Yeah, we just have a few minutes. Well, I actually have one of my own, if I may. So you were talking about the common heritage of mankind as a fundamental concept that China has consistently supported. And I'm wondering how you would distinguish that or compare that to this concept that China, Xi Jinping has recently put forward himself of a community of common destiny,
Yes.
right? And shared future of mankind. I think when he started talking about this concept, this new phrase, this new wording at some UN forums, people misunderstood actually and thought that this was a callback to the common heritage of mankind. And now people are starting to understand this is something distinct, but it's not really that clear what it is. Are they overlapping, related, completely distinct? Should we not see them as having any relationship to each other?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. I think that's
That's a rephrase of 5 principles.
Yes, I think I've done some research on this. What is this? In my opinion, I think, we have this rules-based international order. Everyone is talking about it. To me, this community for shared destiny of mankind is a Chinese vision of the order of the world. So you have the rules-based international order, but then you also have this different concept that reflects China's, well, basically President Xi's idea about kind of how a world should look like. I think that's kind of that is the overarching concept that they are trying to put different things into it to distinguish themselves from the US version of the rules-based international order. I think that's what I understand about community for common destiny. What's that called? Shared future for common destiny.
The community of shared future
shared,
of mankind. It's
of
got a word
mankind.
for it.
Yes. So that's something I understand. What's the relations between that and the common heritage of mankind?
Does it necessarily embrace and include common heritage of mankind as a component of it, do you think?
I don't think that there is any direct mention about common heritage of mankind. But somehow this concept is very broad. You can really put a lot of things into that basket. And indeed, like a coexistence, 5 principles of coexistence were somehow reflected there. And I think, to be honest, even China's deep seabed law, which was adopted in 2016, was talking about a concept called for the benefit of well-being of mankind or something. So they don't just directly use common heritage of mankind. So they use a very vague word called for the word common well-being of mankind. What does that mean? I really don't know, but we will know, because especially when the commercial mining begins, we will know. We will know what that means, because this common heritage of mankind, at the core of it, is the benefit sharing. The mechanism of benefit sharing. How do you share your benefit with those countries which have no capacity to conduct mining? How are you going?
Which we had gotten into that one. I know it was beyond your brief, but it's one of my favorite issues. And it's not just the benefit sharing; it's the environmental impact.
Yes.
Of deep seabed mining.
Yes,
which we're now confronting.
Indeed.
And whether your favorite institution, the UN, is really up to snuff is a question. So I think we're run of time. So I'm very sorry that we didn't get to some of the questions on the queue, but we really have to thank you for a very engaging conversation. Thank you.